Hi friends. So I would like to deepen some sharing about this whole magical mortals concept and the two tools that I use to talk about how we are both magic and mortals all at once. So to do that, I'm going to start with the mortality component of my skill set and work. The mortality component of my skill set and work comes from my training as a Western allopathic nurse who focuses on hospice and palliative care work. And if you can believe it or not, I'm in my 16th year of practice, which is incredible to me. Such an honor to do this work. So one of the fundamental things that I love to teach about is the relationship between function, time, and illness. And today I'm going to introduce those topics to you and point you to where I use them and how I use them for death literacy. And then we're going to blow it all out and talk about magic and how magic fits into this death literacy mortal framework that we have agency over to varying degrees. But we're going to talk about that more. All right, let's talk mortality. Let's talk death literacy. This is my colorful friend, the skull, which represents the two concepts above. It also represents the central place of our nervous system, which is magnificent. And I will share how magic is in our nervous system. But before we do that, let's go back to mortality. So, my favorite tool to talk mortality is this. It's talk about disease trajectories, which are diagrams that have come from a pair of health researchers, Lynn and Adamson in 2003. And this diagram of disease trajectories, which I also call illness stories, I've seen it also called like the story of dying, etc. This gives us an essential diagrammic way, which I love, to understand the relationship of three things: time, function, and illness. So, to anchor our time axis, when I talk about time, I talk about when we have our first breath, which is the beginning of this graph, and when we have our last breath. And in this space, I really want to invite you to all spend a moment, take a breath with me, and think about time not as an abstract concept, but as very clear increments. I want you, going forward, to savor time as increments of years, and then months, and then weeks, and then days, and then hours, minutes, seconds, and moments. And in this way, we can become friends with time, because time is so important to the concept of now and infinity in magic. But we have to start with the concrete appreciation of time in very tangible chunks. So, when we look at time from first breath to last breath, we expand out and we can appreciate how illness can potentially impact our physical function between the space of first and last breath. In my other work, I talk about very specific illness stories, such as the illness story and how cancer looks on this, and how dementia might look on this, and how chronic organ disease might look on this. But really, what's important for you to think about outside of this concept of illness is, what does a normal life look like typically? So I'm going to draw that with my finger. And I'll identify that we'll start off with just talking about physical function right now. And if we start at our first breath when you're a little tiny baby, most normal, air quotes, timelines look like this. At your first breath when you're a baby, you have very little physical function. And as you move forward in the time-space continuum, generally, we increase our ability to have physical function, and then we're somewhere over here, and the inevitability is the closer we get to our last breath, the less physical function that we will have. This decline of physical function is related to illness. I will also share that this narrative assumes that we don't start off our first breath without some intrinsic underlying challenge to our physicality. So this I present and I acknowledge as quite an ableist perspective, because when you have an illness that impacts you from your first breath, that's a whole other situation altogether. So a moment to honor illnesses as the first word I have in the first iteration of explaining these concepts. I'll put that aside now. Now I want to talk about function, because in the classic interpretation of this work, function is defined as the physical ability to do activities of daily living, which are, clothing yourself, cleaning yourself, feeding yourself, etc. I'd like to expand this and define it in my words as the ability to choose to focus our attention and actions in ways that express meaning to us and or joy. So my take on this expands this and blows it all the way out more broadly, which is where we're starting to shift from death literacy and mortality to the magic aspect of what I want to talk to you about today. So we're just going to honor that mortality includes the ability to appreciate that we have these finite meat sacks in physical bodies that are bound on the time-space continuum by a first breath and a last breath. And my death literacy work specifically examines how an illness may impact the trajectory of time, whether it's years, months, days, hours, weeks, how that specific trajectory towards our last breath might be impacted with the express intent of being able to focus our finite resources in what is meaningful to us and joyful to us. So that's my nurse work. Now, I want to take a moment to shift into magic work. So, I study hand analysis, which is a modern form of palm reading. I call it modern palmistry. My lineage comes from Richard Unger, who's an American hand analyst who pioneered this fusion of Western approaches to hand reading and Eastern palmistry, and he fused them together with appreciation of neurobiology and to certain degrees, cognitive behavioral therapy, with the intent not to predict our outcomes, because honestly, that's bullshit. There's nothing predictive about your future. The express intent of hand analysis or modern palmistry is the desire to empower people with more self-awareness so they can make choices. How this fits with the mortal map that I have shown you is this. Bringing back to the previous concepts, keeping the definition of choice above, anchoring first breath and last breath, and time at the bottom. I want to acknowledge that, when I spoke about mortality, I was speaking pretty much exclusively about our physical reality. We are more than just meat sacks. There's a component to all of us that is non-physical. We can call it energy, we can call it soul, any one of the above things works. I like the language of energy. For me, that is really closely related to soul, because what is our soul except for a collection of energy? And what is energy but incredibly dense amounts of information in the form of vibrations? And that's what we are, bound into meat sacks. Our hands are such an incredible way to appreciate both the meat sack part of us, which is in the shape of the hand, the lines of the palm, and the bottom part actually represents the physical part of us, because the lines of the hand, the shapes of the hand, these actually can change. What does not change, what's completely unique to us, are our fingerprints. And our fingerprints represent the non-physical aspect of who we are, the energetic attunement of who we are. And that is completely unique. It's one vantage point of perception and consciousness that's completely unique to us. And guess what, friends? Though our physical selves might be bound by first and last breath, our non-physical selves have the ability to impact each other. Our creations have the ability to leave a lasting legacy even beyond our last breath. When we think of all the great thinkers and artists that have profoundly impacted ourselves personally, this becomes so true when we think of the personal relationships that leave a lasting impact, whether emotionally or physically, onto your life. That's a more evidence of the fact that we have a non-physical component of ourselves that lasts beyond our last breath. So we begin in this magical perspective and this magical appreciation that, as I define it, magic is the ability to change consciousness at will. If we are points of consciousness, how incredible is that we start to begin to play with expanding our reach beyond the last breath. So we're going from mortal to immortal. We're starting to fuck with time, which is incredible. Something that's so important is this whole piece around choosing. And one of the things that's really important to acknowledge, especially in the time that we live in, is that people's ability to choose, whether that's on an individual level or a collective level. And I'm going to clear this just to bring this into center stage. So the individual and the collective ability to choose is not equal. We know this. If you're living in 2021 and you don't recognize the impact of gender on your choices, the impact of race on your choices, the impact of so many other things on your choices, and you think that everybody's made equal, then wake up. That's not the reality we live in. And we have this incredibly unique opportunity to take up the challenge that is presented before us, to examine how we can burn this system down and bring justice into our realities. Because guess what? Our ability to choose often is related to trauma. What is trauma? Trauma is, in my definition, the inability to choose, to react, express in a moment because our nervous systems are overwhelmed and we go into freeze paralysis, or we go into habitual reactivity. And really, this is not authentic choice. Trauma exists on both an individual and a collective level. And the way that trauma is expressed and passed on is that it is actually passed on through our nervous systems. The systems of oppression that have existed for generations, especially with white supremacy and the particular economic systems that those demand, including the subjugation of women and people of color. That collective trauma lives in our bodies and impacts our nervous systems. Context is everything. The stories of what we have lived, our ancestors have lived, these stories live in our bodies, and we inherit the lineage of oppression and trauma through our ancestors, and we see it in the immediate examination of how our parents, grandparents, those around us, the relationships we choose and create after the fact. We see how these, if we're not choosing out of awareness in order to create realities that bring more meaning and joy, it means that we are short-circuited because of trauma. And guess what? One of the reasons why I love reading hands so much and why I persist is because reading hands allows me to present a potential context and narrative that's equal parts incredibly tangible and visceral, and incredibly unique, because these are literally your hands, to understand how your experience of personal and collective trauma may have actually short-circuited your own ability to be aware of possibilities or even perspectives of seeing things that allow you to have choice in how you respond to the world around you, and therefore create different realities for yourself. Choice is the individual experience. Consent is the collective experience of choice. And consent is something that we have the possibility of using as a tool to heal the oppressive default of the world that we have been living in. And it directly impacts our health. There's the public health nurse coming back at you. And that, my friends, is the very first take on how magic and mortality exist together inside you, and how I use my tools to create more awareness about mortality, death literacy, and magic. I hope to be able to do more public work, introducing the two concepts, going full art, talking about how what if our soul is actually our subconscious? And what if our subconsciousness is actually not a mysterious thing that's in the shadows all the time? Our subconsciousness, our soul, is actually embodied. It's in our bodies. And our subconsciousness is the habitual baseline pattern of how our nervous system wants to react to things. So what if we took that perspective? And what if I read hands with the express intent to bring more light onto our shadow parts, onto our subconscious parts, which are also the collective evidence of trauma throughout generations. So I'm very excited to read hands in this new way. I'm delighted. I'm thrilled. I'm over the moon. I have not read hands for 3 years since my huge double D divorce and multiple deaths year in 2018, and I'm so excited to offer it again. I feel like I have both personal experiences of death literacy and midwifing my beloved father, who now sits in the stardust with me, to offer others that are caregiving and wanting to deepen their own understanding and their own intimacy with our mortality. And by the same token, I'm thrilled by this shit. And I completely believe that hands are a powerful way, a powerful offering, an invitation to the information that is already crystallized in your body. So I have 2 events in August, and I hope to plan more events. So I will be posting those and sharing those on my social media. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this whole glorious creation for you, my fellow beloved magical mortal.